What is your thought on that suggestion, this belief, this notion that somehow all of these terroristic acts that are committed against black people, that somehow this is the result of white people being ignorant about some aspect of racism or lacking awareness, knowledge of racism?
Yeah, I take, as you know, I have a huge problem with this issue, with this concept, right? I find it untenable and I find it apologetic to endow white people with virtue and almost a childlike innocence when they have to deal with something like white supremacy and racism. The argument seems to proceed on the fact that even when white people do seemingly deliberate acts against racialized peoples, racialized folk, that even those acts where they directly benefit from it are done out of ignorance. And I think that what this sustains is this kind of cherub nature, this nature that white people are really aiming and willing to learn and to correct their behavior if just this right black person came along and taught them what to do. I find that just ridiculous, right? I mean, we have to look at the historical context. We know that white people have done the same types of behaviors. They've discriminated against black people. They've called black people niggers. They've called black people God knows what other names. They've always vitiated blackness. They've secluded and segregated blackness. To repeat those things doesn't seem to be the work of ignorance. In fact, it seems to be the repetition of historical knowledge about how to treat black folk. So when we see the same thing, ignorance seems to be just an unrealistic apologetic. The other problem I have with this is, as you say, this makes its way into the academy. I mean, the dominant way that we do race and racism today in the university is to endow white people with this type of ignorance. And actually the work that I'm doing right now on anti-ethics specifically responds to this issue, right? That every time we think that we're talking about race or racism, what we do is we elevate white people's morality and their type of character so that they become these very neutral and observer speakers where they can be influenced and allegedly objectively arbitrate racial realities before them. This is all false. I mean, even the work that's done in implicit bias shows that white people have some very deep-seated cultural and unconscious anti-black biases in their interactions and in terms of their social reality when looking at engaging black folk. So to suggest that white people are simply innocent, right, because ignorance does in many ways connote innocence, to suggest that they're innocent simply because they do not know or hence ignorant doesn't really capture the cultural and the psychological works of how racism against black people function. And what this does is this elevates certain black speakers, and this is the really important part. To suggest that white people are simply ignorant and need to be taught elevates certain black speakers to the position of the teacher. And we spoke about this before when I talked about critical race therapies, right? When the black people say, oh, they're ignorant and take on the charge of educating these white people who have committed racist acts instead of ostracizing them or attacking them, they now become that preferred Negro. They become the person that's rewarded with the publications, with the invitations, because they're just trying to teach white folk. The black person that holds those white people accountable for their racist acts and for the effect that those acts have had on other black people, well, that person becomes the radical. So white ignorance is a kind of dialogue and rhetoric that's gained hold precisely because it maintains white virtue. It allows us to see white people as being the good, innocent, intellectual, rational person that can learn to change, whereas black people are the collateral damage of such engagements. Because as that white person changes, black people are still being discriminated against, and they're actually the material, the substance of the lesson. I just find that to be an unacceptable consequence for such empty rhetoric.
Empty rhetoric. Absolutely. In fact, as you said, maintaining white virtue, maintaining white supremacy. One of the important concepts that you shared in your response, you said that there are frequently black people who are in the academy, or even if they're not in the academy, they can benefit. They become the teacher.
Oh, yeah.
If white people are ignorant about racism, then I can just, if you get my book, if you invite me to do a seminar or a lecture, you'll be all caught up. We'll get you up to speed and you will no longer be racist. I see the power and really the danger of this belief in white ignorance, that even a lot of black people who, they don't have any publications, they don't do any lectures, they don't get a shilling, not one coin, from making an effort to teach and absolve white people about racism. Just that belief, I think it's holding on to, as you said, this empty rhetoric, this hope that these acts, Michael Dunn, Paula Dean, whomever we're speaking about, that these people, they just don't know what they're doing, and that somehow that makes it a little more palatable, a little more bearable for black people, as opposed to just accepting the harsh reality that white people might be ignorant about some things. Racism is not one. Your response?
Absolutely. And remember, in each one of those cases is black people who are suffering. In the case of Dunn, a young black man died. In the case of Trayvon, a black man died. And, Ayanna Stanley, a little black girl died. A family was attacked. Right? White people are not ignorant of the effects that they have, because that's what keeps them on top. In fact, the proof of that would be the kind of rationalizations they give about the victims in those cases. How is it that white people are ignorant when they're constantly proclaiming things like, he was a thug, it was self-defense, we should support Zimmerman because this also relates to our Second Amendment rights, right? They seem to come up with pretty sophisticated reasonings behind their racism to either support it intellectually or support it through financial means. So then when we say, even though they're upholding these political and, vehement social positions, they're all just ignorance, the poor white people. This is ridiculous. And it keeps making black people the consequence, right? The consequence of their alleged ignorance is our death, especially for black men. And you see, and this is a problem that we have in the academy, because in the university, the way that we talk about ignorance is that person that says, let's dialogue. And I complain about this all the time. I say that, look, it's funny to me that in critical race theory, the most profound person is the ignorant white liberal. Because the ignorant white liberal is the white liberal you can pull off the street, ask them their views about racism. They say civil rights work, white people change, and we should all talk. And that becomes the substance of every academic paper in the university. How is it possible that the non-academic, who simply repeats the rhetoric, the popular rhetoric of white ignorance and misunderstanding and dialogue on racism, becomes the most profound speaker because every paper in the academy is based off of that kind of rhetoric? It makes no sense. And it suggests that the language of ignorance is really part of a cultural and societal propaganda that tells us something about white people rather than the actual research of anti-blackness, white supremacy, and racism. The real issue here is that black people are affected by white supremacy. So we have people like Carter, we have people like Derek Bell, we have Frantz Fanon, we have W.E.B. Du Bois using this specific language. Hell, we even have Martin Luther King using this specific language. But in order to preserve the idea that white people have changed and that white people are making progress, we disown all of our other theorists. We disown our forefathers and foremothers who's created an intellectual basis to understand anti-black oppression. And we replace that with our bourgeois desire to be recognized and accepted by our white oppressors. So we give paper after paper, we present book after book that has no real profound thought about black folk. It simply says we can get along and open up the conversation and let me speak. As if when we go to these conferences and speak with these white folk and they go back to their universities or to their segregated homes, that they're somehow believing that, now that we've had this conversation, I need to divest myself of whiteness. And this is the important part. These conversations, this alleged ignorance that white people have, at no point cause them to ever divest. They never make the mistake in the wrong way, right? So they always make mistakes that seem to perpetuate racism. They never seem to make mistakes that take away racism. They never open up their homes. They never sell their homes. They never give up their jobs. They don't do anything against their white interests. But then when they act in favor of those same interests, suddenly it's black people, black PhDs to the rescue to embrace the white person and make them feel comfortable about their racist acts. This is a real problem. And, as you know, following my segment on Reading News Review, I'm really interested now in researching the way that the black bourgeois, the black academic class, allows white people this type of pass. I mean, this is how we create people like a Tim Wise, where they know the language, they know the rhetoric, but white people are much more comfortable talking to a white person, telling them how racist they are and that they're ignorant, than a black person saying, not only are you ignorant, but your ignorance causes black people their lives because your ignorance is a coping mechanism from your own humanity. That's not what white people want to hear. They don't want to hear that the reason they don't see black people, they don't acknowledge immoral acts against black people, is not because they don't know them or because they're not deliberate, because it's the way for them to cope with the type of inhumanity they constantly demonstrate against darker races each and every day in their own white existence. That's the reality. That's the truth. That's Du Bois's comment that you get out of Darwin. But nobody wants to speak about those type of historical ills, because when you put white people and white individuals in the context of white supremacy, then you're talking about white individuals as white supremacists that deliberately reify and integrate and propagate their own whiteness to their own benefit so that society and their children's children will have the same end that they do over other darker peoples. But that becomes too sociological and historical, and they keep telling people that we can't be determined by our history because we want pure, rational, and virtuous individuals. It's all propaganda that's propped up by the university. It has nothing to do with the actual historical, sociological realities that confront black people on a daily basis.
What is your thought on that suggestion, this belief, this notion that somehow all of these terroristic acts that are committed against black people, that somehow this is the result of white people being ignorant about some aspect of racism or lacking awareness, knowledge of racism?